The awakened don't vanish. They step away from the collective mask to keep the soul unbroken and return only when truth can speak through them. Carl Jung. There's a mass exodus happening that almost no one is talking about. Some of the most conscious, spiritually awake, and psychologically developed people are quietly disappearing from society. Not angrily, not dramatically, but with a kind of gentle retreat, leaving social media, walking away from careers, ending relationships, and choosing solitude over the noise of the crowd. If you've noticed it, you might have wondered, why are the wisest among us slipping away just when the world seems to need them most? Carl Jung predicted this very phenomenon. He called it the necessary withdrawal. When a person becomes deeply conscious, when their awareness expands beyond the ordinary, participation in what he called the collective unconscious becomes not just frustrating, but physically painful. Jung saw this retreat not as escapism, but as an essential step in the individuation process, the lifelong journey of becoming one's true self. In this video, we're going to explore 5 profound reasons why spiritually awake people are quietly disappearing from society. Each reason will take us into the hidden psychology of awakening, and you'll discover why awakening often feels like incompatibility with the world. And here's my promise to you. By the end of this journey, you won't just understand why the spiritually awake withdraw. You'll also see how to live with greater inner freedom, how to honor your own call to solitude without shame, and how to recognize the deeper meaning behind what looks like loss or retreat. If reflections like this resonate with you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel Jungian Mindshift. It helps us grow a community where Jungian wisdom, psychology, and soulful living can continue to flourish. So let's begin with the very first reason Jung believed this withdrawal is not only natural, but essential for the survival of the awakened. Jung called this withdrawal essential. As people grow more conscious, remaining in society begins to feel like a betrayal of the self. The spiritually awakened can no longer convincingly play roles, no longer maintain a polished mask for approval, and no longer ignore the collective shadow without exhausting themselves. What once felt ordinary now becomes suffocating. A dinner party filled with gossip may once have been amusing, but now it ends with a headache. A workplace conversation about profit and competition that once sparked ambition now provokes nausea. The change does not lie outside, but in the awakening of perception within. Carl Jung believed that individuation is not a choice, but a destiny. The psyche pushes each of us toward wholeness, and once this movement begins, the individual sees with painful clarity the falsehoods surrounding them. Jung described this as facing both the shadow and the mask of the persona. The persona is the social face, the mask that allows us to function as parent, worker, or friend. It has value, but never contains the whole truth of the self. The shadow is the rejected part of the psyche, the impulses, fears, and desires that society and the individual prefer to hide. Most people deny the shadow, projecting it onto others while clinging tightly to the mask. But awakening makes this dishonesty unbearable. To continue performing feels poisonous. For this reason, Jung viewed withdrawal not as cowardice, but as psychological necessity. He wrote that participation in the collective unconscious can become intolerable, even physically painful. The awakened person's body often rebels, showing stress, anxiety, or illness when forced to remain in false environments. To walk away becomes an act of preservation, not selfishness. It is the psyche protecting its own unfolding. Critics disagreed with Jung, accusing him of promoting isolation or elitism. They suggested that withdrawal could be used as an excuse to abandon social responsibility. They argued that the world needs conscious people to remain and resist rather than retreat. Jung countered that true engagement is only possible after individuation. Unless the individual has faced their shadow and reconciled inner contradictions, any participation in the collective causes risks reproducing the very unconsciousness they hope to challenge. Activism without inner work easily becomes another projection. Solitude, then, was not the abandonment of responsibility, but the preparation for it. Consider a man in his 60s who has lived decades in corporate life. Outwardly, he appears successful and admired, yet inwardly he feels hollow. He wakes dreading endless meetings and ruthless competition. Years of ignoring this dissonance erode his health. Panic attacks, insomnia, and sudden anger dominate his days. A doctor prescribes rest, but what he truly needs is withdrawal, a step back to face the parts of himself buried under decades of persona. He sells his shares, moves to the countryside, and returns to painting, a passion from his youth. Society may call it regression, but in truth, it is individuation, his soul reclaiming itself. Ignoring this call comes at a heavy cost. Those who resist withdrawal often remain outwardly successful, but inwardly hollow, plagued by depression, addiction, or emptiness. Jung warned that the unconscious, when denied, grows stronger and begins to rule life from the shadows, with midlife crises emerging as the delayed eruption of long-buried truths. The gift of withdrawal, however, is renewal. In solitude, the awakened person rediscovers their true voice. Silence reveals not emptiness, but a richness long hidden beneath society's noise. New patterns of meaning appear, guiding them toward genuine consciousness, where action arises from inner alignment rather than social demand. Jung called this withdrawal essential, because it contains a paradox. Stepping away from society is not abandonment, but preparation to return with clearer vision and a freer heart. Like the hermit who enters the wilderness and brings back wisdom, the individual must disappear for a season before offering truth to the collective. This is why the spiritually awakened quietly vanish. They are not rejecting life, but protecting it, preserving their energy so they can live more authentically, even when the world cannot yet understand.
Awakened individuals feel psychologically alone, even in crowds. They begin to notice patterns others overlook, and this new clarity isolates them. They see society's shadow projections in every direction, political fights that disguise fear, scapegoating that hides insecurity, social media outrage that reveals unacknowledged anger. To the ordinary eye, these events look like normal disagreements, but to the spiritually awake, they appear as symptoms of mass unconsciousness. Once seen, these patterns cannot be unseen, and the result is a profound sense of estrangement. One striking example of this withdrawal can be seen in the life of Dave Chappelle, the celebrated comedian who shocked the entertainment world in 2005 by walking away from his television empire. At the height of his career, with fame and fortune pouring in, he suddenly retreated to South Africa, abandoning a $50 million contract. To many observers, it seemed irrational. Some accused him of throwing away his career. Yet in retrospect, his decision mirrored precisely what Jung described as the curse of consciousness. Chappelle had looked too deeply behind the curtain of entertainment culture. He sensed that what surrounded him was not truth, but a collective game of shadows, pressures, expectations, and projections that threatened to consume his authentic self. From a Jungian perspective, what Chappelle experienced was the collision between persona and shadow. His persona, carefully built as the witty, daring entertainer, had become a mask that millions adored. But behind that mask lay his shadow, the doubts, the vulnerabilities, the truths he felt he could not express in a system that demanded constant performance. Jung warned that when the persona grows too dominant, the individual risks losing contact with the deeper self. To remain in that role would have been a betrayal of his psyche. Withdrawal was not cowardice, but a desperate act of preservation. This also reveals another key element of the curse of consciousness. Jung often spoke of the loneliness that comes when one steps outside the collective trance. Chappelle himself admitted that he felt trapped by the machinery of the entertainment industry, as though he were no longer a man but a product. Once awareness pierced through, he could not return to unconscious participation. The laughter of audiences, once intoxicating, began to feel like chains. In this way, his retreat to South Africa was a symbolic journey into the wilderness, much like the archetypal hermit. In Jung's language, it was the individuation process, demanding solitude so that a truer self might emerge. Critics at the time mocked his disappearance, calling it madness or paranoia. Yet this reaction itself reflects the collective unconscious. Jung observed that society often resists those who step outside its norms because their actions expose truths others would rather avoid. When someone refuses to play the game, it unsettles the players who remain. The hostility Chappelle faced was not proof of his error, but evidence of projection. He had become the screen for others' fears about freedom, failure, and authenticity. The cost of ignoring this inner demand is severe. Had Chappelle forced himself to continue under the weight of his persona, he might have suffered the fate Jung described: neurosis, depression, even collapse. When consciousness expands but is denied, the psyche revolts. Many public figures who suppress their truth eventually fall into addiction or scandal. Chappelle avoided this by stepping away, giving himself space to heal and reorient. His later return to comedy carried new depth, less about pleasing and more about truth. This reflects Jung's teaching that individuation is not permanent exile, but transformation, where withdrawal makes renewal possible. The hidden gift of awakening is authenticity. Solitude reconnects the individual with what is real, stripping away illusions that mass culture depends on. As Jung wrote, until the unconscious is made conscious, it will rule life as fate. Chappelle's story shows what becomes possible when one chooses conscious withdrawal over unconscious surrender. This is why spiritually awake individuals vanish from society's stage. They are not rejecting humanity, but refusing to live as shadows. Their retreat is strength, not weakness. A liberating recognition that once illusions are exposed, they cannot be unseen. From here arises the deeper truth Jung revealed. The awakened spirit cannot fully harmonize with ordinary culture, and this clash pushes the conscious soul further from the crowd. And what about you? Have you ever felt the need to step back from the crowd to protect your authentic self?
Being around unconscious projection feels like psychological violence. For the spiritually awake, every environment saturated with persona performance and shadow denial becomes suffocating. Social media demands curated images. Workplaces demand loyalty to systems that drain vitality. And even personal relationships can become arenas where masks clash instead of souls connecting. What once passed as harmless small talk now feels like an assault on authenticity. The awakened individual senses energy not just intellectually, but almost physically, as though falseness leaves bruises on the psyche. A revealing example of this dynamic came from one of Jung's own case studies. He once worked with a woman in midlife who suffered constant exhaustion and vague physical ailments. Doctors found no organic cause, but she described feeling utterly drained after social events, office meetings, or even family dinners. She explained that the conversations around her always revolved around appearances, gossip, or ambition. Outwardly, she smiled and played her role as wife, mother, and professional. But inwardly, she felt herself vanish. Jung interpreted her condition as the psyche's protest against environments that demanded continuous persona performance. Her authentic self could not breathe, and so her body began to manifest the strain. When she began to withdraw, limiting her social obligations and devoting time to painting, her health improved dramatically. What seemed like illness was in fact a crisis of energetic incompatibility. Jung would say that every person carries a limited reservoir of psychic energy, what he called libido. This energy fuels not just sexuality, but thought, creativity, spirituality, and the very drive of life. When the majority of that energy is consumed by upholding masks or defending against others' projections, little remains for individuation. Spiritually awake people notice this drain more intensely than most. They sense that inauthentic environments cost them vitality. Withdrawal is not about disdain for others, it is about protecting energy for the work of the soul. This truth has been confirmed in modern psychological surveys as well. Research on introversion, empathy, and high sensitivity shows that individuals who are more attuned to emotional undercurrents often experience fatigue in overstimulating social environments. Though Jung's language of archetypes and shadows differs from contemporary psychology, the insight is parallel. Consciousness heightens sensitivity, and sensitivity requires boundaries. The awakened soul cannot remain immersed in unconscious projections without paying a heavy price. The risks of ignoring this incompatibility are serious. Those who force themselves to remain in environments that drain them often experience anxiety, depression, or psychosomatic symptoms. Their authentic self suffocates under layers of performance. Jung saw such conditions not as random disorders, but as the soul's rebellion against misuse of energy. Just as a plant wilts when planted in the wrong soil, the awakened psyche withers in environments where truth cannot live. Yet when individuals honor this incompatibility, transformation becomes possible. Solitude or conscious withdrawal allows their energy to reorient toward deeper sources. The patient who once suffered from constant fatigue discovered that hours of painting alone left her more energized than days of forced socializing. Her creativity returned, and with it a sense of joy. Jung explained this as individuation at work. Energy withdrawn from false performances was reinvested in authentic expression. What began as illness became the doorway to a more genuine life. This points to the paradox at the heart of energetic incompatibility. By stepping away from ordinary society, the awakened do not abandon connection, they cultivate a deeper one. In solitude, they find communion with the unconscious, with archetypal images and symbols that link them to the greater whole. What looks like retreat is in fact alignment with the deeper rhythms of life. Without protecting their energy, such communion would be impossible. Thus, energetic incompatibility explains why many spiritually awake people vanish quietly from the noise of daily life. They are not fragile, nor are they antisocial. They are safeguarding their most precious resource, the psychic energy that fuels growth, healing, and creativity. Their withdrawal is not escape, but fidelity to the soul. And from here we move naturally to another truth Jung emphasized, that solitude, though often feared, can become a profound medicine, turning apparent isolation into the ground of renewal.
Jung described an archetypal hermit stage, a retreat into solitude where integration happens. It is not an act of escapism, but one of preparation, a period when the individual develops wisdom, authenticity, and consciousness that cannot flourish in the collective environment. This stage may seem like withdrawal from the outside, but from within it feels like a homecoming. The individual finally has space to listen to the inner voice rather than the clamoring of the crowd. Examples of this phase are not limited to modern times. In fact, the archetype has been alive for centuries. Think of the desert fathers of early Christianity, who left the cities of Rome and Alexandria to live in caves, seeking silence in the Egyptian desert. Their withdrawal was not born out of hatred for humanity, but from the recognition that spiritual clarity required solitude. They understood that the noise of markets and political debates clouded the inner vision. By retreating, they cultivated wisdom that later nourished entire communities when seekers traveled to learn from them. Another ancient example is Lao Tzu, the legendary sage of Taoism. According to tradition, when he grew weary of the corruption and confusion of society, he rode westward on a water buffalo, leaving the imperial court behind. At the border, a guard begged him to write down his wisdom before departing. The result was the Tao Te Ching, a text that has guided millions for over 2,000 years. His hermit phase gave birth to teachings that continue to shape spiritual life today. Without retreat, that wisdom would have remained unspoken. Jung would explain these examples as expressions of the collective unconscious. Across cultures, the archetype of the hermit appears because human beings have always intuited the necessity of solitude for deeper integration. What differs today is the intensity of modern life. In ancient times, communities were smaller, rhythms slower, and daily life more connected to nature. People had natural pockets of solitude, long walks, hours of tending fields, nights under starlit skies. Because society itself was less overwhelming, the need for dramatic withdrawal was less common. But in our current world, dominated by constant noise, digital distraction, and social pressure, the call to hermitage feels sharper. The soul demands what modern life refuses to give. This explains why the hermit archetype resonates so strongly today. The spiritually awake find themselves drowning in relentless stimulation. Even in their own homes, they are bombarded by the artificial light of screens and the endless stream of opinions. Unlike our ancestors, who could find moments of natural silence, we must carve them out intentionally. Jung suggested that individuation requires withdrawing from collective patterns long enough to hear the whispers of the unconscious. The ancients demonstrated this truth, but modern conditions magnify its urgency. The costs of ignoring this archetypal phase are considerable. When individuals resist solitude, they often remain trapped in collective identities, unable to differentiate their own values from those imposed by society. They may live efficiently, but not authentically, carrying a gnawing sense of emptiness. Jung warned that without withdrawal, the self cannot integrate its shadow or develop its unique voice. The result is conformity at the cost of the soul. Yet, when the hermit phase is honored, transformation follows. The Desert Fathers returned from silence with words of compassion. Lao Tzu's retreat produced verses of enduring wisdom. In Jung's view, the hermit's withdrawal prepares the psyche to re-engage with life from a deeper ground. The individual who has lived in solitude carries back authenticity, a perspective no longer dominated by collective illusions. Their presence itself becomes a kind of teaching, even if they never speak a word. Thus, the hermit phase is not a modern invention, but an ancient archetype. Human beings have always sensed the necessity of retreat, though in earlier times life itself provided more natural stillness. Today, the call is louder because the noise is greater. To follow this archetype is not to abandon humanity, but to serve it more truly. And so we move to the next insight Jung offered. Solitude as medicine for the soul, a healing force that transforms isolation into renewal. If Jung is right that the hermit phase is medicine, what kind of healing do you think it could bring to modern life?
Disappearance is part of individuation and a psychological necessity. It is evolution, not weakness. When spiritually awake individuals withdraw, they are not abandoning life, but allowing themselves to evolve into a more authentic form. Jung believed that individuation is the deepest calling of the human psyche, and sometimes that process requires stepping away from the collective, so that new structures and deeper truths can take root. What looks like retreat is in fact preparation for a future return. One example of this can be seen in the Japanese concept of ikigai, a lifestyle approach that emphasizes living with purpose, balance, and inner alignment. In regions like Okinawa, which is famous for its long-lived residents, many elders have quietly structured their lives around simplicity and rhythm, rather than competition or constant social display. Their withdrawal is not dramatic. It shows up in small daily choices, gardening, morning rituals, or long periods of silence. To an outsider, this may seem like disengagement from the fast pace of modern society. Yet in reality, it is a form of conscious evolution where the self chooses depth over noise. Jung would interpret this through the lens of individuation. In societies that value harmony with nature and respect for inner rhythm, individuals often find it easier to step away from the collective illusions. The Okinawan elders, who rise early to tend their gardens or walk quietly through their neighborhoods, are not rejecting society. They are embodying a rhythm that aligns personal life energy with the larger flow of existence. Their lifestyle demonstrates that withdrawal does not mean abandonment. It means transforming the way one participates in community, less through performance and more through authentic presence. This distinction was important to Jung. He argued that individuation is not selfish isolation, but the creation of a more integrated self capable of true relationship. When people evolve inwardly, their outer contributions gain depth. The Japanese example illustrates this well. Those who live by ikigai often become community anchors. Their wisdom, patience, and calmness influence the younger generation, not by loud activism, but by quiet example. Jung would call this the fruit of individuation,
where the integration of shadow and self allows a person to radiate stability without forcing it. The risk of misinterpreting disappearance as abandonment is that society loses sight of its value. Many cultures equate constant visibility with success. When someone withdraws, others suspect weakness or failure. Yet Jung insisted the opposite is true. The psyche often demands withdrawal as a stage of transformation. Without it, people risk becoming trapped in conformity, never discovering the deeper truths that their life is meant to embody. The Okinawan model proves that such withdrawal can be integrated into everyday life, creating communities that flourish not through endless striving, but through balance. If this stage is denied, however, the individual remains split. Outwardly, they may achieve, but inwardly they stagnate. They may live by rules and roles imposed from outside, never hearing the voice of the unconscious that tries to guide them toward authenticity. Jung warned that the price of such neglect is emptiness, a sense that life has been lived without meaning. When people avoid the call to disappear, they also avoid the chance to evolve. The gift of honoring this evolutionary withdrawal is profound. The self becomes more whole, less controlled by projection, and more capable of contributing real wisdom to the collective. The Japanese elders who quietly embody ikigai show that it is possible to disappear from the noise while still belonging deeply to life. Their presence is felt not in headlines, but in the peace they bring to their families and neighbors. Jung would see this as evidence that individuation always serves both self and society, even when it looks like solitude. Thus, disappearance must not be misinterpreted as abandonment. It is the psyche's way of preparing for deeper engagement, of evolving into something more authentic. By stepping back, the spiritually awake are not turning their backs on humanity. They are shaping the inner ground from which humanity's next truths will grow. And this leads us to the final realization that individuation is ultimately about integration, the uniting of shadow and light so that life may be lived in wholeness.
We have journeyed together into the mystery of why spiritually awake people quietly withdraw from the world, guided by Jung's profound insights. What at first appears as disappearance is, in truth, a deeper transformation of consciousness. It is the soul seeking refuge from the weight of the collective, the individual daring to listen to the inner voice rather than the endless noise of society. This path is never about escape, but about becoming, about the slow, patient work of individuation, where shadow and light are brought into union, and life begins to shine with authenticity. Jung reminded us that the unconscious will rule us until we make it conscious. Withdrawal, then, is not weakness, but the courage to face that hidden terrain. Those who step back are not turning their backs on humanity. They are preparing themselves, nurturing wisdom that cannot be born in constant distraction. And when they return, they bring with them a clarity and presence that quietly changes the world around them. If these reflections stirred something in you, don't just move on. Show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel Jungian Mindshift. And share it with someone who needs to know that their yearning for solitude is not a flaw, but a sign of awakening. Finally, may you honor both the quiet and the light within you, for in that union lies true freedom.